Justin, that.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Is there a motion to adopt the agenda?
I'll make a motion.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Item 3 on the agenda is to review and approve the minutes for the meeting held on July 16th, 2024. Is there a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. And I'll hand it over to staff for their draft presentation of the ordinance for cottage-style housing.
Okay, great. Good evening. So before Alisanne walks you through the draft cottage housing ordinance, I really just wanted to hit a couple of high-level points kind of concerning why staff feels that this ordinance is really a good step moving forward. So a lot of it has to do with the discussion of affordable housing within our community and kind of the lack of supply that we're seeing for the demand that we have for housing. Affordable housing, as you all are aware, is a really complex topic, and it means a lot of different things to different people. So I kind of wanted to flesh out how this ordinance may, contribute or help alleviate some of the problems regarding the demand on housing. So our thought process behind a cottage housing ordinance is really that it creates another housing segment within the market that we don't currently have. You will hear a lot of times when people are talking about making improvements or improving housing affordability, it often comes back to zoning because zoning does create barriers and expenses depending on what is involved. So this ordinance just kind of creates a new segment within the city's market that a developer could pursue. Another kind of component of that is thinking through what that segment of the market might be in terms of who might desire to live there. So the regional housing study that the data has wrapped up and the study is to be completed any day, identified that not only do we have a shortage in kind of overall housing, but we kind of have a mismatch in the housing availability in terms of number of bedrooms and then the demand. So we have more kind of 3 to 4 bedroom units than the 1 to 2 bedrooms, and we need more 1 to 2 bedroom units. So staff sees cottage housing in this kind of size as a way of meeting that market, whether that be for young professionals or small families or aging seniors. Another way that this type of development could help alleviate some of housing cost concerns is that it requires less infrastructure costs to be divided over kind of potentially the same or more dwelling units. So certainly that helps in a developer being able to provide a product not only because it's smaller, but because the infrastructure costs are less in terms of the public roads and the different things that would be required in a typical subdivision. And then the last item that I wanted to touch base on is how this might be beneficial to the city as far as what we refer to as an infill lot. So we are seeing a significant amount of residential development within the city, and the city has a finite amount of land, and so a lot of those larger pieces of property are being developed. But we do have some places within the city that maybe could create these infill situations where you could have as few as 4 cottage units, again, as long as it met a minimum size, square footage size that Alisanne will talk about as part of the draft. But staff sees this as a way of really making kind of the best use of the land that we have, available within the city. And then I know Alisanne is likely going to cover this in more detail, but I did just want to say that this evening, obviously no decisions required officially. We wanted to bring this to you as a draft ordinance that we have been working on, and obviously want to gather some of your feedback, questions, and concerns. We have this legal counsel reviewing the ordinance to make sure all of that is in order. And again, we would, kind of more completely vet it with Public Works and engineering. So there might be some questions that are still kind of outstanding, but we wanted to get just, an initial gut check from the Planning Commission since we've had the work session, and give you really something more concrete to respond to in terms of, okay, we've done a lot of research, we've looked at a lot of different cottage housing ordinances throughout the country, and come up with this draft. So I just wanted to kind of give that overview before Alisanne dives into the draft ordinance. Thank you.
Okay. And with that, I just also want to say, this is a fairly long presentation, I'll admit. So feel free to interrupt with questions as we go or clarifying points as we go, because it is a bit long to wait till the end. So anyways, with that, so just a brief high-level overview of what cottage housing is. It's a grouping or cluster of small houses arranged around a common area or areas, depending on the size of the development. The housing types can be mixed. They can be detached, attached, or townhomes. And it appeals to a wide variety of people. Commonly mentioned are young professionals, couples, empty nesters, older adults, single adults, small families, and mainly because this community provides that sense of, or this type of community provides a sense of community. Because those houses are fronting on that common area, you get to know your neighbors more easily. And so before I dive into the ordinance, I wanted to go through a couple examples of what these communities look like. And I've collected a couple here from across the United States that I've stumbled across in my research. And the first one I wanted to show you is a community called Conover Commons in Redmond, Washington. This neighborhood consists of about 25 units on 9 acres. And it's a fairly sizable parcel, it only has 25 units on it, and part of that was because it had a very challenging topography and wetland issues, so it made the developable area very small. And so rather than going the traditional subdivision route, they went the cottage housing route, and were able to preserve a lot of that, the steeper slopes and the wetlands, and still provide a nice small community here. This particular community has 2 housing clusters. It's got sort of an upper cluster up here surrounding a common area, and then it's got kind of a longer, lower cluster that surrounds a smaller common area, and then walkways link the whole community. It also has a community building right here that's used for a number of community events and functions. As far as parking goes, it has a sort of a mix of a couple on-street spaces and then garages. They're detached garages for the residents. There's a couple views from Google Maps that I have to kind of give you an idea of the community. But that building sort of in the lower part here, those are the garages for the vehicles. And then last shot, I like this picture just because you can really compare it to sort of your more traditional subdivision development and then what these cottage communities look like, which are much more focused on that green space with parking on the outside of those communities. The second example I have is a very different design style than the Conover Commons. This is the Grove at Powell Park in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this features 10 units on 1.6 acres. And so you have the units that actually, this is much more of a traditional subdivision style development in many ways, except the houses are smaller. These houses front onto a public street and then a private street here. They have very traditional 2-car garage, driveway. You kind of see, so you have that where they front, and then they back up to a sort of narrow common area. So all the back of the houses empty out into a long, narrow common area that runs up the center of the development. So this one's sort of a different style, but still falls within that realm of cottage housing. And then the last example that I wanted to throw up here was actually, I stumbled across it because it was part of a HUD case study about this type of development and how successful it can be. So this is the Cottages on the Green in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. It features about 15 units on 0.82 acres. And this is one of those cottage style communities that has a mix of housing types. It's got townhomes, duplexes, and also single detached houses. And these houses range from about 851 square feet to 1,094 square feet. And it's also a mixed income community. And you can see here, this is how they've done the parking. They've done a parking lot off to the side here, and then they've centered, they've done the 2 rows of housing with the common area in the center here. That's how they've designed this one. Another thing to point out is this one is an infill parcel, and to the south of it and across the street, and you kind of see it in this picture, it's got commercial developments or big box stores with large parking lots on the sort of south and east side, and then on the northern side and western side, it's got established neighborhoods. So this was an example of an infill parcel lot that was developed. I thought this was kind of interesting. It just showed, what the site looked like originally, what a multifamily concept might look like on the same lot, a single apartment building with the parking lot, and then what this concept ultimately looked like with the parking lot and the 2 rows of houses for a total of 15 units. And then that's just a nice shot of what the individual houses themselves look like. This is the townhouse unit, the 3 attached. You got the single detached, and then those duplexes, those big front porches. And so with that, we'll kind of start getting into the ordinance a bit. And first, I wanted to briefly go over the type of residential uses we do allow now within the city, either in the residential zoning districts. You got the single-family detached and attached, the 0 lot line house, 2-family house or duplex, the corner lot duplex, multiplex townhouses, multifamily buildings, and the upper story residential. And all of these housing types are permitted in varying areas of the city, depending on the zoning district, and they may be allowed either by right, meaning that they are allowed without the discretionary review. They do not go before planning commission or council for review and approval, but they are still required to meet the standards in the zoning and subdivision ordinances. Or they could be allowed by the conditional use permit, which does mean they go through that discretionary review process. So they are allowed by one of the 2 means. And so with our cottage court ordinance, we would want to permit them by CUP, and we would want to permit them, the ordinance currently shows them being permitted in all of our residential districts, but then also some of our mixed-use districts, the MXB district and the local business district, the LB district. And the thought behind this was, again, for that flexibility. Since it is a conditional use permit process, each of these can be sort of looked at to see how well they fit into whichever zoning district they are proposed for. So our ordinance's definition, and this definition is sort of based on quite a bit of research that that we went through, looking at a bunch of different ordinances, and what we came up with was a cottage court is a group of small detached houses, townhouses with a limit of 4 attached units per structure up to 50% of the development, or tiny homes fronting around a common space. It can be developed on either individual lots or with a common form of ownership. And this overall definition of the ordinance, and we'll get into the details in just a few moments here, is meant to sort of bring that flexibility to it.
I have a question. With the homes being smaller, will lot size then play a role into what can go on there? Because I'm thinking ideally you could have like a 3-acre lot with a cottage style home on it. But I know that some lots now have frontage requirements. Would that still be in play considering the size reduction in the cottage home?
So I think she'll probably answer your question as she continues, but it's important to recognize that I think there's a tendency to think of the tiny home being kind of the purpose, but really the cottage court, it's a minimum of at least 4 4 units. And so as she continues, there is, within the ordinance, a minimum kind of square footage of an overall lot. And then really it might be developed under common ownership, like a condominium, so it wouldn't even have individual lots. It might just all be on one parcel. Or it could be divided out into individual lots, and really that kind of square footage size, what would affect that would be kind of the density that we've placed, the required open space requirement, both private and communal. So all that would kind of go into play, if that answers your question. And probably as she continues on, some more of those use standards or dimensional standards will be more clear.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to our purpose statement, that this provides sort of the overall intent behind the ordinance and why we, it's which is not now, but could be a permitted housing type. So the purpose of the cottage court housing type is to promote infill development and redevelopment within established neighborhoods that is consistent in style and materials with existing surrounding structures. By situating many housing units in small spaces, cottage courts are an efficient use of land and cost-effective in delivery of city services. The cottage court housing type encourages innovative site planning and variety in housing types to meet the needs of diverse populations, including young professionals, older adults, empty nesters, and small families. The housing is pedestrian scaled and community oriented, and it provides developers and property owners the flexibility to develop projects that strengthen the existing neighborhoods.
And I just wanted to point out one thing within this section of the purpose statement that I know came up when we did our work session with the Planning Commission and City Council, is that third line there that says that these developments would be consistent in style and materials with existing surrounding structures. And so rather than try and be super prescriptive within the ordinance to say we want these types of colors or these types of materials or these types of roof pitches, if we were that prescriptive, then it might not fit in to certain areas. So we're trying to create that flexibility there and kind of put that onus on the applicant to show us, okay, you're trying to infill within this community that's mainly brick or mainly, and work to that end. So that's where you'll see that flexibility within the ordinance.
And this first use standard here really speaks to that. This first requirement of the ordinance is that the cottage court development should endeavor to fit in or be respectful of the context of the surrounding neighborhood. Architectural details shall be submitted with the conditional use permit application to show how the development will be compatible with that broader neighborhood. So that really is putting the burden on the applicant to show that, yes, we're using the style housing, the materials that is compatible with the overall neighborhood. So that is the first use standard to the ordinance. Moving on to second. And this goes back to the flexibility piece. The ordinance would allow projects to be developed either on a single parcel of land, sort of condominium style, or as rentals with a property management entity on a single parcel, or they could be subdivided with units on individual lots with a homeowners association owning the common areas, managing those common areas. So the ordinance would allow for both options, depending on the developer and what project they're trying to seek. And then just a couple quick examples of what that looks like. The communities that we looked at sort of did all of those things. So this one on the right, the Poplar community over in Boulder, Colorado, this is a condominium style unit. They've got this one big parcel of land, this is their tax map, and then each of these units are individually owned. But it is that single parcel of land. And then this one is Danielson Grove in Kirkland, Washington. And this is the subdivision style. So they've got the homeowners association that owns and manages the common areas, and then you have the housing units on individual lots within the community. Okay. And so the next use standard would only allow cottages that are within the local business and mixed business districts to be used as short-term rentals. So this keeps that more commercial-oriented use in the areas that already allow a mix of commercial and residential uses, and keeps that out of the neighborhoods where you want to promote more homeownership and long-term rental type situations. And then as far as review requirements go, the ordinance suggests or would require, and here again goes back to whether or not it's a subdivision or a single parcel. If it's a subdivision, then it would go through this subdivision process requiring a preliminary plat, public improvement plan, that process. If it was a single parcel and must be developed more condominium style, then it would go through the major site plan review process like apartment buildings go through now, and commercial development. And the sixth use standard is about trash and how the community is going to be, because these are communities where the houses do not actually front on public right-of-ways. That's a bit more difficult question to answer. They're not just gonna be able to wheel the trash to the driveway curb and have it picked up. So we want the applicants to have some sort of plan for what they're going to do in regards to the trash receptacles. Is it gonna be a dumpster? Is it gonna be, some sort of plan for that? And then number 7, each unit shall be required to meet all building code requirements and shall obtain a permanent certificate of occupancy upon completion. And this use standard is really meant to take into account specifically things like tiny homes, which are often built off-site and aren't inspected before they're moved to the property. And so this would cover that and say, it has to be inspected and approved prior to being able to live in it. So that's the thought process behind this use standard. And as far as unit sizes go and minimum and maximum square footage, we aren't placing a minimum unit size on the units. However, there still would be some requirements in the building code that would apply, that would sort of already necessitate a certain unit size. So there is some restrictions there. But then we are restricting the maximum square footage to 1,200 square feet of finished floor area and 1,700 square feet of gross finished or gross square footage. So that would take into account any add-ons like porches, decks, patios, that kind of thing. Maximum area of 1,700 square feet. And staff settled on the 1,200 square feet primarily because the research showed that a lot of communities, some communities didn't have any restrictions, some communities did, and it seemed very common that most cottage units sort of fall between the 800 square foot and 1,200, 1,500 square foot range. So that was sort of the thought behind that.
And then one thing that I wanted to point out is to kind of keep it, consistent with the purpose of cottage housing and kind of what I talked about in the beginning about affordability in a certain segment of the market. That's why we felt like it was important to have a maximum. There would be the possibility for a developer who wanted to have kind of like communal spots and fronting on greens and a little bit more flexibility than what our existing subdivision ordinance allows. We do have a planned unit development, which does allow them to kind of create their own code of development and do that. So I think, kind of having this with a maximum square footage keeps it the intent of what we're talking about. And then people who were maybe interested in similar themes, but with larger houses could pursue that through the planned unit development, is what we were thinking.
Okay, moving on to parking requirements. So the ordinance has 1.25 spaces per unit that is required. And that parking areas rather than individual driveways would be encouraged, and that those areas would be clustered in logical areas throughout the development. So if it's on the larger side, serves space logically. If it's on the smaller side, maybe it's a single parking lot along the side, like several of the examples showed. And then also, if the parcel has an existing alley access, then the parking area should be accessed from that alley. And staff landed on the 1.25 units per acre, primarily because the research showed that people that tend to live in this type of housing have fewer cars. And most ordinances seem to require that one space per unit. Some did require 2 spaces per unit. Because these are, sort of oriented towards smaller infill parcels, the less parking is probably better in a certain sense because of the space restrictions, but then again, you can also count some on-street parking towards that. So the 1.25, you have at least 1 space per unit, but then also some extra there for guest parking or what have you. And then the ordinance also states that parking can be located within an accessory structure, so something like a multi-car carport or a garage. That particular structure can't be attached to the buildings, but it can be an on-site structure, accessory structure, that can be used to park cars. And then you could also have single-car garages and carports that can be attached to the rear of individual cottages. So if you want that private space, you can have that as well with the carport or garage, or of course a driveway. And then, because these are community-oriented developments, you want to make sure the parking is positioned so that the cottage housing units are that focal point. You step out your front door, you're not stepping into your driveway, you're across the road from your neighbor. So you want to keep that community aspect and arrange the parking accordingly. And then also the parking areas, if they're parking lots, they'd be screened with the applicable landscaping standards of section 98-5. And that contains the language for the screening of parking lots in residential. So I wanted to show just a couple examples of the various types of parking lots and parking configurations that some of these communities have. The first one again is that cottages on the green development, and they had that single parking lot off to the side available for their residents. Another one is a multi-car carport. This one is the cottages at West Village over in Oregon. And you can kind of see that carport right there with a couple cars underneath. And then you have this one that sort of has a public road. It's very narrow, but it's a public road that runs along the outside of the units. And each of the cottages is accessed by an individual driveway, and you have that common area in the middle. So there's a couple different, I had one more. And then you have attached and detached garages. These are a series of connected garages, and then you have 2 detached right there that provides the parking for the residents' vehicles. And all of them are sort of off to the side there.
And with these various kind of configurations, what we don't want is the main focal point to be kind of like driveways or parking lots. And so as Allison continues with some of the standards, we kind of go into that, but just, that's kind of the reason for some of these is that, either they'd be landscaped, because essentially, with houses that size, if you're having a lot of upfront cars, it can create a scale issue where really you're just noticing cars rather than the homes. So that's kind of the reason behind these kind of specifics around parking and configurations of parking. So when you are walking through or around one of these neighborhoods, you're not just looking at cars, but you're really noticing the homes. So that's the purpose behind that.
Now to get into the common area requirements. So the draft ordinance states that 400 square feet of common space per unit is required. And that the common area should consist of a central space or a series of interconnected spaces. And that at least 50% of the units would abut a common area, and that all units would be in reasonable walking distance of that common area. And that common area should have cottages at least on two sides of it.
And a common thing that you see in several of these neighborhoods is, maybe there's like a central fire pit or something in the middle within that common area, but really just that being the focal point of that communal space, because really the desire of individuals that want to live in these types of communities is that, they're going to become close with their neighbors and kind of have more of a tight-knit community. So that's the reason behind that.
I've got a quick question now. On the common areas, how do you police that as far as what is left in the common areas by private residents and like, whether it be bicycles, toys, grills, this kind of thing? Would that be up to like what the rules set forth by an HOA? Okay.
Yeah, so we would definitely leave that up to the HOA or the kind of condominium, property owners association, similar to like an apartment complex that might be managing those things. And then as Allison continues, there is the requirement for square footage that's considered common area, and then there is a requirement for kind of private
Right.
open space also, so that you have the ability to have a grill or, your own private spot, because you're trying to strike the balance between individuals that do want that sense of community, but obviously everybody wants kind of that private space too. So that's the balance there.
And then as far as what can count as common areas, stormwater facilities, connections between common areas, parking areas, driveways, and other physically constrained spaces such as steep slopes or wetlands, that type of area cannot be counted towards the common area requirement. It has to be usable open space. And then finally, all units should have access to the common areas along with the public sidewalk through the use of walkways. They should be at least 4 feet wide and of a material that meets current ADA accessibility standards. And that just provides access for everyone. And here again, a couple examples showing how various communities have done their common areas. This again is that cottages on the green in East Greenwich. You can see they have walkways that interconnect all of the houses. You got a couple common green areas. I think one of these things is supposed to be a community garden of some kind. So you have lots of little gathering spaces in the center there, the common area. This is again Danielson Grove and Kirkland. They actually have a community building that they use with a patio, and then you have this big, large sort of green lawn in the center as their common area. Then here again is the Conover Commons. They have sort of the two clusters of houses. You have a larger green common area up here, and then sort of smaller one down here. But then each is connected with those walkways, so you have access to all the common areas on foot. It's not too far away. And you have, of course, that community building up here that is used. And then finally, this is smaller community duplexes called Castle Street Cottages, also in East Greenwich, and they have sort of that fire pit idea, sort of a central area here with pathways from each unit to that space. Getting into the required private areas, each cottage housing unit shall be provided a minimum of 200 square feet of usable private open space. And this should be space that's separate from the common open area to create a sense of separate ownership and sort of privacy. And it can include backyards, gardening areas, patios, porches, some sort of space private to that house. And no dimension of private open space shall be less than 8 square feet. So trying to ensure that it's a usable space. Here again, a couple examples. This is cottages on the green again. You have the common areas in the centers, but then you also have the private areas. So this one has a backyard patio. You also got some front porches. So these sort of make a combination of sort of small backyard areas with those front porches as their private areas. Here again is the Popular community. They've got a common area in the center, but then they have these sort of smaller front yards and porches that count as their private open space areas.
Allison, I got, on the previous slide, it says, each cottage housing unit shall be provided a minimum of 200 square feet of usable private open space. Then at the bottom, it says, no dimension of private open space shall be less than 8 square feet. What's the difference there?
So the dimension has to be at least 8 feet, right?
Yes,
You can have a 2 foot by 10 foot strip.
right,
Here,
right. So you have to have at least 8 square feet, and, you know, you can have, you have multiple private open spaces, but, you know, depending on how you,
Oh, okay, I got it.
Like any one space to make up your cumulative.
That's the total.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, got
Yeah.
it.
yeah. Okay, and then moving on to the orientation of the units. So because this is a slightly different style of development than a more traditional subdivision, the fronts of the cottages often will not be facing a public right-of-way, a public street. They'll be facing each other on that common area. And so to ensure that, you know, what, as this says, make sure that houses don't feel like they're turning their backs to the street, to make sure they're sort of pleasing to look at like the rest of the street is, they need to include one of 4 or more, you can always have more, but at least one of these 4 options on the street-facing facades. You can have changes in exterior siding material and paint color, make it a little more interesting. You can have windows, including a bay window, building modulation with the depth measuring at least 1 feet, so some changes there, and then views of front doors or porches, so you have that visual interest. And then this again states that the majority of those units shall orient around a common area to promote that sense of community, rather than fronting maybe directly onto that public street.
And with these, you know, and you all are familiar, we have the requirement within our ordinance that, you know, if you have an alley and a street, that, you know, it faces the street, because you want that kind of front orientation or your front entryway to kind of make sense along the entire corridor. But in this instance, the desire is for them to front internally, because that's kind of that communal aspect. But then obviously you wouldn't want it to look drastically different than other buildings that have their front entry on the street. So the hope with some of these items that create visual interest is so that it doesn't look like a bunch of cottages that have turned their back and are just kind of blank walls around the outside. So that is, you know, how it fits in with the neighborhood while also meeting the intent of that communal area.
Would we have the situation where we could possibly run into the same scenario? I think it was Peachtree, where you have the street that runs in the middle, similar to that style that's being proposed, where they're facing that the internal street. Would that fall under city maintenance, or would HOA be required to maintain that street if it's not a public city street?
Sure. So in these situations, in most cases, there would not be a street, like a new street that would run through to create the development. There might be a communal parking area that can sometimes, not a street, but it's kind of like a parking lot. So the parking lot would definitely be privately maintained. I guess the ordinance does not preclude them from putting in an alley if you know, it was a large enough parcel and it was something they wanted to pursue. But yes, in that case, it would be private. So I guess I have not thought we would have an instance, and I guess I'm just thinking through right now, where we would have new public roads with these types of developments. We would be not trying to avoid that, but essentially that wouldn't be the model that we're looking to create. If they were going to be putting in new public roads, I would say they would lean much more towards that PUD route and create that. This would be, you know, they really don't want to have roads. It's kind of trying to avoid that, just walkways and communal parking areas.
Access to that parking area.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And these are just a couple examples of how communities have sort of dealt with the street-facing sides of these units. So this one, the cottage is on the green. The entrance to this house is actually onto the common area, but they have this nice big wraparound porch that adds sort of continuity, visual interest on the street-facing side. These houses too, these are the Poplar community in Boulder. They do have front entrances onto the street, the two houses that front on the street, and they also have these nice big porches, kind of hard to see because of the vegetation, but they have, they each have sort of nice porches fronting onto that street area. Then, of course, this is that development in Raleigh that has that sort of traditional garage entrance onto the public street. That's the way they dealt with it. And this one also has sort of lots of windows. And you have a front porch and some windows on the units that actually face front onto that street. And this is the table with the area and dimensional standards. So this might answer a couple questions, Nigel, that you had earlier. So we are looking to set a minimum tract size, an overall parcel size, or multiple parcel size of 10,000 square feet for each of these projects. It's the minimum tract size that you can use to build one of these.
And that number is kind of, when we look at all the requirements we have for the, you have to have at least 4 units to make it a cottage court. You need to have the 400 square feet of common area and the 200 square feet of private, and then parking. And so really, that was kind of the minimum size we felt comfortable with that would allow you to kind of get all those components within the development.
And then there would be a building setback from that overall project perimeter, that tract. There would be a setback from that, front, side, rear, a 10-foot front setback, a 10-foot rear setback, and then 5-foot side and interior setbacks. Kind of hard to see the arrows because they're so small, but I tried to get an example of this because it took a minute to wrap my head around it. But basically, buildings, rather than having setbacks for each of the buildings on the interior of it, if they're on individual lots, it's an overall parcel setback. And they are slightly smaller than some of your standard single-family because of, generally speaking, what we anticipate to be the limited tract size. And as far as density goes, the ordinance recommends 4 units as the minimum and a maximum of 20 units per acre.
And 20 units an acre, is that consistent with our existing multifamily? So our existing multifamily zone district, that is the density, 20 units an acre. So, kind of think about this in some way. It's definitely single-family detached, but especially if it's done as the condominium style, it is kind of like a multifamily development.
If they did decide to go the subdivision route, we're not enforcing a lot size minimum. I think that would be decided on a case-by-case basis, depending on the development and what they're trying to do, and that would be determined at that time. And then as far as building separation goes, it provides for a minimum separation of 10 feet between units. That is, generally speaking, the minimum that you can have without requiring extra fire protection. And if they happen to be any closer than that, or if any of the projections, like the roof eaves or something like that, is closer than that 10 feet, then they need to have some fire-resistant construction in those areas if they happen to encroach within that 10-foot separation distance. And then finally, the maximum building height would be 35 feet, which is pretty standard for our residential districts. However, if you're doing multiple levels, say a 2-story cottage or a cottage with a loft or something like that, there could possibly be a step back requirement, so it doesn't, so that they don't appear to sort of tower over the neighboring cottages.
And we have an existing step back requirement for like commercial buildings or multifamily buildings that are adjacent to residential, just so it's kind of not coming over top of you.
And then finally, as far as any vegetative buffers between these developments and the neighboring residential or other uses, decided the best way to pursue this might be on a case-by-case basis through the conditional use permit process. And this is primarily because we anticipate these parcels to be sort of smaller, more constrained infill parcels. And so our traditional Class A, B, and C buffers, which are 10, 15, and 20 feet wide respectively, might not work well with the development. And so this would allow us to determine what kind of buffer might fit best with a particular project, depending on what they're trying to do. And then finally, there is an alternative standards section that just says that alternative designs that do not comply with all the provisions that we've just gone through may still fulfill the intent of this article. Alternative designs may be considered during the conditional use permit process. So if there's something within those use standards that we've just gone through that doesn't quite work with the site, but you have a proposal that will work, we can consider it, and maybe it still fulfills the intent but doesn't meet those requirements, and this allows us to determine if that's acceptable through that conditional use permit process.
And that, I mean, that's always, you know, you never want to water down an ordinance so much. But a standard like that is extremely helpful when you get into a situation where, you know, everything works, but maybe kind of one idea or one change that they have that really, you know, still meets all of the intent and purpose of the ordinance, but our staff's hands are kind of tied, and then you're looking at ordinance amendments, or, so really that section is just to kind of say, here, you know, if you're gonna present a proposal to us, make it look like this ordinance says, but if you can't, and there's some difference or something that, kind of a new or innovative idea that we didn't think of, that's something that we could set as part of the conditional use permit after review and approval by, you know, or through the public hearing process and also through the planning process, so.
And with that, a couple things that staff's thinking about in regards of potential applications for this ordinance, and what the requirements would be for that application, that conditional use permit application. First of all, they would need a completed application form and fee, but then they would also need to provide us a site plan detailing what they're trying to do, how they're laying it out, all the details we've been going over, but then also a project description, and preferably pictures. You know, what are the, you know, what sort of architectural details are they going for? What might some of them look like? Basically demonstrate that the project meets the use standards and intent of the ordinance. So those are probably some of the things we'd be looking for as part of a CUP application as far as staff is concerned. And then also, we've been thinking about possibly having a list of standard conditions that would automatically be attached to these applications. We're thinking about, you know, that site plan and project description being attached as a condition. You know, you're going to develop the site according to what you've said. You know, quite possibly that would be one of the items, and then there may be some others as we go through it. And that's about it.
I got a question. I'm gonna take a guess that all the requirements that are in this proposal are designed to eliminate the possibility of somebody with an acre going over here to Stewart's Draft and buying 5 boiler barns and putting them on slab foundations with plumbed-in bathrooms and calling it cottage housing.
So, yeah, it would have to be, it would have to meet a building code. So if a type of boiler barn was then able to be inspected either by a third-party inspector or by one of our inspectors and determined that it could be habitable through a certificate of occupancy, but there wouldn't be kind of a free-for-all of anyone being able to buy any type of structure and bringing it there. So it would have kind of stringent building code requirements, there's a lot of things that are being done through modular and otherwise. But no, it couldn't, it would have to be able to receive a certificate of occupancy from our building department.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there current demographics that the city's collected or has that could possibly help predict what the demand would be for cottage-style housing?
So really the only kind of concrete data that I would say we have comes from the regional housing study. And I could get you some of those numbers because I don't want to misspeak on the percentages, but there was definitely a section within that study and the data presented with that study that kind of talked about the need for 1 and 2 bedroom units, and that we have an increasing demand for those numbers and then not as many within the market that we need. And I think, times have kind of shifted and maybe people are waiting later to have children. I think people are having less children. So the kind of large 3 to 4 bedroom homes aren't really meeting, maybe some of the demand that we're seeing. So we would have that. And I will just point out that this draft ordinance really just creates the ability for the market and the ability for a developer to decide, if this is something that they would want to pursue or bring to the table, whereas they don't have that ability or option now. I think Winchester has a cottage housing ordinance, and I'm not sure if they've ever had a development that has pursued it. And then there are other localities, obviously, that Alisan showed that have. So I think it would, our role and as staff is trying to just create that ability for the market to decide, if that makes sense. But some of the data around, the need for 1 and 2 bedroom homes is out there. And then I think you might have, young professionals or aging seniors that, maybe don't want to live in an apartment complex. Maybe that is the only kind of option for them, but they'd rather kind of maintain their own private area, but still be kind of in a communal situation. And so kind of meeting that need.
Do you know if Albemarle County has a cottage-style housing zoning ordinance in place?
I am not 100% sure. I know that I worked in Old Trail Village a little bit some time ago.
That's what I was referencing, because a lot of them, particularly when you were talking townhouses or row houses, I call them, they're slammed together. They front on a street, but in the back is all the parking, the amenities, and all that.
So in that case, it's done through a planned unit development, so a PUD. And I know that, so they can create some of that flexibility within that ordinance. I'm not sure if they have a standalone cottage or if they just kind of allow the creation of, and the flexibility through the PUD. Because, I haven't been there in a while, but they're larger homes in most cases that kind of don't meet that cottage square footage that we're envisioning with this.
Some of them are three or four
Sure.
stories,
Yeah.
and they're stacked together like slices of bread.
Yeah.
You may have already covered this and I missed it, but would manufactured homes be allowed in the cottage setup?
So I think, we'd have to do a little bit of work on that because I think manufactured housing is allowed right now as a CUP. So it's not what we and I think it's also important to clarify because I think manufactured housing, like we think of in terms of what is maybe traditionally people think of as like a single wide or double wide. I think there is some manufactured housing that looks more cabin-like, so some newer style things. So we wouldn't want to prohibit or preclude anything. So I think it would be just another component of the conditional use permit process. If someone said, hey, I've got this idea to do manufactured housing, then certainly those intents and purposes within the ordinance to say, okay, how does that fit in with the existing neighborhood? Show us what that looks like. So there's no outright yes or no as it's currently drafted, but there's enough upfront requirements that we would know that and that it would help to inform a decision moving forward. So And just to remind everyone, this ordinance, if adopted, would only allow for someone to apply for a conditional use. It wouldn't allow anyone the ability to just go out and start doing cottage housing, but it would allow them, if they found a lot that worked, to apply for a conditional use permit. So any cottage housing development, if this ordinance gets approved, still comes back through the planning commission and council for that site to determine, okay, does it make sense here, and what architectural standards are needed. So it's not an outright yes or no, but there's continual review, and as part of the CUP process, that would be very clear to the decision makers approving or disapproving an application.
Yeah, and I guess one way to get around that too, or to maybe help define it, would be to require new housing. If it's gonna be manufactured, as somebody can buy something 5 or 10 years old and drop it into a cottage.
Sure, and I think a lot of that would go back to the intent. If someone came to us with that idea, and for cottage housing, it would,
Yeah.
we have a manufactured housing park or manufactured home subdivision ordinance designation, so the intent would be, well, actually, you're thinking more of that and should zone for that designation. So really going back to the intent and purpose within the ordinances is important too.
Did you have a question?
No, I was
Okay.
just gonna say that what they mentioned for the application requirements and being very specific with requiring a site plan and, a layout and what types of architectural designs, being very specific there is what would limit you. Plus, a lot of those manufactured homes dimensionally wouldn't work to be able to front to each other on the acreage that you're looking at.
Right.
So,
Sure.
but being very specific and saying, you come, you have to have it laid out, you have to have designs, pictures, and don't just open-end it. Will preclude all that.
Okay. Were there any other questions? No?
So I guess at this time, staff, some kind of process moving forward was, just kind of wanting it to bring it to you all for, thoughts, feedback. We will be running it by legal counsel. We've asked them a couple questions on a couple things, making sure Public Works and engineering and building official, who've already given some general kind of comments around it, are good and feel comfortable with it. And so then at a future time, we would be scheduling a public hearing and presenting it to you again, kind of, and seeing if, the community at large has any comments around the ordinance. And then you would make a recommendation on the ordinance to council, and then we would, present to council. And then if the ordinance is adopted, then it would just allow developers to come in and make applications that would then again come back through you. So it's just kind of important to remember, any adoption of the ordinance isn't, somehow creating, well, it can happen anywhere situation. It would be a case-by-case review with all of the requirements as detailed.
Okay, thank you. If there's nothing else, we'll move to item 5 on the agenda, which is review of minor subdivisions and final subdivision plats approved since the January 16th meeting.
Okay, I do have one of those for you this evening. It's for 1115 Reservoir Street, over on the east side of the city. It's actually right next to Fairfax Hall. So this plat basically subdivided off several parcels for single-family detached development. Divided off 8 parcels from the larger whole parcel. That's the purpose of this plat. And that is the only one I have for you tonight.
Is that the horse field?
No, it's the woods behind it where the horse barn and swimming pool and all that.
Used to be,
is.
okay.
I walk by it pretty much every day. Ivanhoe is at the top of that arc right there. And then D Street runs down on the right side right there. But there's some tremendous, well, if you do a lot of infilling, there won't be, but there's some elevational changes right there between Reservoir, Ivanhoe, and D Street. building right behind the parking lot at Fairfax. I can't tell from where the lines go.
There are
I
some
believe it's that
existing
white
buildings,
building right there.
there's some existing buildings right here that are on that parcel.
Yeah, those are the apartments out back.
And so the plat, if you'll switch to the next one, so the plat, you can see those 8 lots that they have kind of cut off under, existing by right zoning development. So any kind of further division of the property that didn't have road frontage, if they were gonna try and put some kind of internal road in and do some further development, it would require, preliminary plat, but these were kind of coming under those minimum standards for those 8 lots, 8 lots.
Now, this doesn't include lots that were cut out of the field in front of Fairfax to build homes, does it?
No.
Cause that was approved a number of years ago, and whoever bought them and got it approved never had to go.
Yeah, so this is just that one larger piece there, and then you can see the 8 lots that were created through the minor subdivision process.
That, okay. Next on the agenda would be public comment period for items not on the agenda. Is there anyone who wishes to speak? One? No? All right. Matters from staff?
I do have one thing. So city staff has prepared a resolution that I would like to read, and then if approved by the planning commission, present to Ms. Boyle. We did want to allow the ability for Will to sign once he's back. So we'll present you the official copy later, but I wanted to read it and then would entertain a motion from the planning commission to approve the resolution. So a resolution from the Waynesboro Planning Commission. Whereas the city of Waynesboro, in consideration of the dedicated service of Shannon Boyle, and whereas Ms. Boyle served on the city of Waynesboro Planning Commission for 8 years, from October 2016 to August 2024, and whereas Ms. Boyle served as vice chair of the city of Waynesboro Planning Commission from October 2018 to September 2019, and whereas Ms. Boyle served as chair of the City of Waynesboro Planning Commission from October 2019 to February 2024, and whereas the City of Waynesboro Planning Commission is desirous of expressing their appreciation and thanks to Ms. Boyle for her dedicated service on this commission. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the City of Waynesboro Planning Commission does hereby publicly thank Ms. Boyle for her service, which she has so aptly fulfilled with diligence and concern for the citizens of the City of Waynesboro. Be it further resolved that this resolution be adopted by the commission, recorded in its minutes, and a copy presented to Ms. Boyle.
I'll make a motion to approve the resolution.
I'll second that.
Second, all in favor? Aye. All right, congratulations.
Thank you. We appreciate your service. So we will let Mr. Flory sign it, and we'll get you a copy. Okay. Thank you.
Is there any commissioners' correspondence?
No, I would just like to personally thank Shannon for her service. She has been here longer than I have, and she has been here with me ever since I joined the commission, and I hate to see her go.
Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Come see us in our new building. That's all I have to say.
Will do. If there's no further commissioners' correspondence, we'll move to adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.